Afternoon, everyone. You're so very welcome to today's Living with Vaccines panel. The event today is part of the Living With series that's held in partnership with ICON, a global provider of drug development solutions and services to pharmaceutical, biotechnology, medical device, and government and public health organizations. The company specializes in the strategic development, management, and analysis of programs that support clinical development from compound selection to phase 1 to 4 clinical studies. Founded and headquartered in Dublin since 1990, ICON currently operates from 90 locations in 37 countries and has approximately 13,680 employees. My name's Gillian Roddie, and I'm going to be moderating the panel today. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Karina, I'll hand over to you first.
Hello, my name is Dr. Karina Jakubowicz, and I'm a lecturer in English literature. And I currently teach at Florida State University at their London campus. And my reason for being involved today is because I'm participating in the vaccine trials at Imperial College London.
Thank you so much, Karina. Molly, could I hand over to you?
Certainly. Thanks, Gillian. And hello, everyone. My name is Molly Byrne. I'm Professor of Health Psychology in the National University of Ireland in Galway, where I direct the Health Behaviour Change Research Group. So our normal business is the development and application of behavioural science to developing behaviour change interventions. So usually my work is in the area of prevention and management of chronic disease like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. However, since the outset of the pandemic earlier last year now, I have been focusing a lot of my research work and energies in the area of COVID. Obviously, behaviour change is very critical to the response. I'm working on a number of COVID-related projects, international and national, and I'm also a member of the advisory group set up by the Department of Health, focusing on behaviour and communications, one of 9 advisory groups who advise the National Public Health Emergency Team on COVID. So delighted to be participating today, and thanks again, Gillian.
Thank you so much, Molly. Luke, I'll hand over to you now.
Yep, thanks, Gillian. I'm Luke O'Neill. I am Professor of Biochemistry in the School of Biochemistry and Immunology in Trinity College Dublin. I'm an immunologist. I've spent, I guess, over 35 years now working on the immune system with a specific interest in inflammatory and infectious diseases. And of course, COVID-19 being the infectious disease we're most concerned with here. My lab then has 4 projects on COVID at the moment. We mainly work on the therapeutic end of this disease, so trying to develop novel anti-inflammatories to limit damage once people are sick with this disease, but also a big interest in vaccines. My vaccine interest is more to do with adjuvants, which are the molecules that make vaccines work better, I guess, and I've spent a number of years working on different adjuvants.
Thank you so much, Luke. And rounding out our panel, I'm delighted to introduce Nuala. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, Nuala?
Thank you very much, Gillian, and I'm delighted to be here today as part of this eminent panel. My name is Nuala Murphy. I'm President of Clinical Research at ICON. We're an organisation specialised in clinical research across all therapeutic areas. However, today is really to talk about a key area of development, notably notwithstanding the pandemic last year. And I'm proud to say that as an organisation, we're working on over 100 COVID-related activities, whether it's within the field of treatment or indeed in vaccines. So delighted to be able to have a conversation today about how we've really been contributing to this solution.
Thank you all so much. I mean, it's fair to say this, that we couldn't be talking about something more topical for today. But before we get into the nuts and bolts, Luke, could I invite you to just maybe have a brief recap of where we've come from, really talking about where we are in terms of COVID to date.
Sure. As we just said, it's great to be on the panel, by the way. Great to hear all the different expertises. It's unusual to have this mix. So well done to the Science Gallery and ICON for bringing us together. I'm going to be interested myself in what we discussed. But, well, I mean, it's remarkable. You have a situation at the moment where this virus was only first described on the 11th of January, 2020. The Chinese scientists released the sequence of the virus. That begins the journey. And now we have, as we all know, we have the Pfizer vaccine, we have the Moderna vaccine, and the AstraZeneca vaccine, all approved in different jurisdictions. But I'm sure the EMA will catch up pretty soon. And then we can expect the Johnson & Johnson vaccine next. There'll be 4 vaccines approved. And then moving towards April, May, June, July time, I would predict another 2 to 3 vaccines. So it's a remarkable achievement for science. Let's start with that. Because to go from a new virus to get vaccines into humans that's now on the market, I mean, it's incredible, you know. And of course, the reason for this is quite straightforward. It's 30 or 40 years of science was needed to get to these sort of, I guess, inflection points, you might call them. I mean, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines needed this RNA technology. There've been at least 15 years of science behind that. The delivery mechanism took about 10 years to develop. So these aren't overnight successes by any means. And of course, massive immunology about viruses and how they work and how, you know, best to design vaccines against them. So now we're in a situation where we have, I think now Nuala might know better than me, but I think the Pfizer vaccine has been in about 10 million people, you see. So isn't that remarkable since it was approved? Israel is leading the countries of the world. It's been in 2 million people there. Ireland, we're catching up, I guess. We're hoping to ramp up the vaccination campaign, and every country in the world is like this in many ways. And the goal is very simple. If you're an immunologist anyway, the science has now delivered the vaccines, and there'll be more coming down the track. It's now a question of just getting them into people. And there's a number of confounding factors and, you know, logistical issues there. There's hesitancy, as we'll discuss, and these are very much in our minds at the moment, trying to ensure that all this great science is now deployed very effectively. And then, as we'll discuss as well, as you know, the worries people have. And there's worries if you're a scientist, because maybe worry is too strong, or there's questions more than worries. We don't know how long the vaccines are going to last. Will you need a booster shot every year? We don't know about mutants emerging that might be able to dodge the vaccine. Now, these aren't major concerns, but they are there. And if you're a scientist, you put them on the table and you say what the concerns are to get ready for them, and maybe to mitigate against them scientifically if you can. And these are in our minds. Another one would, of course, be, will there be any untoward effects? And that's being monitored very, very closely. These are new vaccines. We're keeping a very close eye. It's called pharmacovigilance, as I'm sure we'll discuss as well. And of course, it's understandable that people have concerns. And it's all of us on the call today, and more generally, it's our job to reassure people, I guess, and try to assuage fears as best we can, and to be as transparent and as open with the data as we can. I think the other thing I would say as well is it's been a remarkable level of transparency, in fact, you know. And of course, we're all aware of why that is. It's because it's a very serious disease. We need to get a mass vaccination campaign. And the best way to do that is to be fully transparent. Anybody could have tuned into the FDA deliberations on this, you know, and all the documentation is available. So it's a really interesting time, I guess, for not just vaccines, but medical science in general, because this will touch on many different aspects of how medicines are rolled out, you know. So I guess we're seeing a big shift in some ways in approach, I guess, is the other thing to say. So that gives you a quick little snapshot of where we're at. And then optimism is high, because I think it's, as we said, it's 90% plus efficacy. That's remarkable efficacy for a vaccine, you see. So again, I think we were in a very good point scientifically, actually. And now we need to think about the next phase of this, which will be very challenging. There's no doubt there's all these challenges ahead of us that we need to discuss and confront head on, I guess.
Thanks, Luke. And I think that's a fantastic recap of where we are. And you know, the novelty of this virus, and all along we were told, as this was all unfolding, very quickly we were told that really the way out of this was going to be through a vaccine, because it's a novel virus. We need to find a way to achieve immunity against that. And we started hearing about vaccine trials. Karina, it's fantastic to have you here, because you have experience of being a part of one of those trials. So can you tell us a little bit about what that was like, and maybe your motivation behind it and the process as it was as being a participant?
Yes, it was an incredibly odd experience. I'd never done any medical trials before. As I mentioned earlier, I'm an academic in the humanities, so all of this was incredibly strange. But I heard about the Imperial Trial in March of last year, which was a time when everyone was panicking and didn't really know what to do with themselves. And at the same time, most of us were being told to do nothing, which was very counterintuitive. You had to stay at home. And so I was looking for things that I could do, you know, looking around online for ways to participate, things that I could look at, ways that I could research my way around the situation. And this trial popped up. And I'd been interested in helping out with the Oxford trial, but at the time that was based in Oxford. The Imperial Trial, however, was based in London. So I actually had a chance to get there and be involved. So I signed up, and a few months later I was selected. And I have to say it was a bit surprising and very exciting, because suddenly I felt like I was on the inside of something that I'd been kept on the outside of for a very long time. You know, this thing was happening out in the world. Nobody knew what was going on, and suddenly I was a part of it. So it was a little bit scary in the sense that it was new, and it was an RNA vaccine, which at that point had never been tried on human beings. I was also part of the safety trial for that test. So there are 3 stages, and the first is the safety. So I was one of 105 people who were going to be injected with very, very small amounts of this substance. And I have to say, when I arrived, all of my initial concerns were sort of blown out the window, because the team there were just so incredibly careful. They were so thorough when it came to checking my medical history, when it came to checking if I had any allergies to any kind of vaccine at all. And the impression that I got was that they had to, you know, dot their I's and cross their T's, not least of all because they were in the public eye, you know, more so than they otherwise would have been. So when it turned out that I was eligible and that they were happy to go ahead and give me the first injection, by that stage I was completely happy with everything that was going on, despite the fact that the thing that was about to go into my body had only been in mice and primates previously.
So this is right back at the very, very beginning of the outbreak. So you became involved in the trial very, very early on.
In June was when I started to be physically involved. And by that point, they'd already released some pretty strong data in Nature Communications explaining that it had been really effective on mice, but it hadn't had any negative consequences, or the negative consequences were negligible. So I was already getting a picture, despite not having a medical background. I was getting a kind of data picture, so to speak, of what this vaccine was likely to do, what effects it might have, and what the risks were.
And that's really interesting, because it speaks to that point that Luke was making earlier on about the transparency and this highly collaborative effort, this global collaborative effort around bringing this vaccine into trial and beyond. Nuala, I'd like to come to you next, because that idea of a vaccine trial, we've heard about this concept in the media, and we've heard about all of this news about vaccine trials occurring. But I'd really love for you to give us an insight into what that involves. What is in a vaccine trial?
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. I'd preface by saying that, you know, regulatory guidance is out there, and, you know, the regulators, you know, are the first ones with whom we consult to really think about the design of a clinical trial. You know, we're talking about very large phase 3 trials. We're also talking about trial designs that are often adaptive in nature, meaning they can be subject to frequent amendments, meaning that they need to ensure that the patient population is representative. So we're also talking about trials that require a large number of patients, can be in excess of 30,000. We've seen one trial that has already recruited in excess of 45,000 subjects. And Luke was certainly alluding to the speed of development. What's been particularly phenomenal about the Pfizer-BioNTech study, of which we were proud to be part of, was that from the proof of concept to emergency approval, it actually occurred in under 250 days, which is unprecedented. And, you know, in order to do that, clearly collaboration is required. Agility is required, working with investigators who really understand how to work with large-scale phase 3 trials and enroll large volumes of patients in a clinical setting, notwithstanding the pandemic, notwithstanding the need to respect distancing. So the whole setup of the clinical trial was complex. It also required innovative technology solutions that allowed you to be able to monitor data remotely, to be able to train investigators remotely. That really has been important in terms of trial execution. Whereas the traditional trial, you have people on site, you work with the investigator, you work with the data on site, centralized trial. And what I mean by that is 90% of the data monitoring occurred remotely. It was also really important to have an agile workforce. I mentioned there's a need for diverse patient populations, but we also saw the trials shifting. Clearly, there was a need to be in areas where there was a high risk of infection. So trials may have started in the US, but also expanded in Latin America, expanded in Europe, and also in South Africa. So it's really important to have an agile workforce who could continue to follow the trial, monitor the data, ensure that patients were safe. But it was also important to ensure that you could cut the data on a regular basis and that the safety monitoring committees could review the data and make decisions on the next part of the process. So being able to have real-time data access, having clean data, being able to meet inspectors' requirements is really important. And it's not surprising, notwithstanding the speed, that the high standards needed to be respected, but also that the inspectors were part of the equation. We were heavily audited, heavily inspected to really make sure that patient safety was really at the forefront of everything we were doing.
Thank you so much, Nuala. It's very reassuring to hear all of those behind the scenes elements, I suppose, as part of the trial. And Molly, I want to come to you next, because the development of the vaccine was, we'll use that, it's been unprecedented. It's been global effort. It's been all of these wonderful things. But is it perhaps a case that the development of the vaccine is really only part of the equation? Because in order for the vaccine to work, it needs to be taken up. Could you tell us a little bit about the behavioural aspects of now vaccine success?
Yeah, no, that's a very nice introduction to this piece, Gillian. You know, and it's very interesting hearing from these different speakers in the panel about the process of the trials and the vaccine development. And as a behavioural scientist, I come to this whole area very much with an awareness that vaccination is one piece, it's one tool in the toolbox of the full public health response. So, you know, I think Luke was referring earlier there to just the golden days of basic science, maybe, and that, you know, that there's been unprecedented collaboration and speed and success. And certainly I feel that behavioural science has also acted in this way, in which there has been huge input. And I think that what has been really reassuring is that Ireland have actually been very successful and progressive in terms of seeking out a range of different types of scientists to input. So as you say, Gillian, you know, we have a vaccine now. This is a very exciting, very hopeful time. And however, it's also a potentially very dangerous time. And certainly in Ireland at the minute, we're in a very, very difficult position with COVID cases, with COVID-related illness. Many countries around the world are in the same situation. And there is a danger of thinking, oh, well, we have the vaccine, the other things aren't important. So I suppose my first point is really the importance of thinking about the vaccine as one component within the full public health response, which will be required for the next year or two. You rightly point out, Gillian, there that not only is that piece important, but also even when we have a vaccine, so the pharmaceutical companies, the trials have developed a number of effective vaccines, which is fantastic. The next stage then is rolling out a vaccine program at a national scale, seeking to achieve herd immunity. That's a logistical challenge for any country. And then the final piece is that even when you've all of that rolled out, the key thing there really is still a behavior, which is people being vaccinated. So I think it's, in a way, COVID provides such a fantastic opportunity for genuine multidisciplinary collaboration. So that certainly targeting that behavior of getting vaccinated is a very exciting challenge. And we do know a lot in that area about how to motivate people to get vaccinated. We know currently from data collected by the Department of Health that around 76% of the population say they will definitely or probably get a vaccine when it's offered to them, which is fantastic. That's a relatively high percentage. We also know that 5% say that they will definitely not. So they're a very hard group to reach, and they need to be reached, but they're a hard group to reach. The group, I think, who are more interesting from a behavioural science and a vaccination public health perspective are the 17, 18% of people who say they might be vaccinated. And I suppose these are the group of people who are experiencing high levels of concerns around the vaccine. Nuala was referring to some concerns that people might have, around the speed of vaccine delivery. So they are the group who I think we can really constructively target. It's probably worth saying as well that there is a gender factor here. So it's really interesting from a behavioural science perspective, because across all the other public health behaviours, women report being significantly higher adherent to social distancing, washing hands, these other requirements. However, when it comes to vaccination, it's the men who are much more gung-ho about, I'll get it, and women who are much more concerned. So I think that's a very interesting finding, and obviously one that's very relevant for any vaccination campaign to address.
Thanks, Molly. I think that there's a lot that we could unpack and unpick from that, and I think that the behavioural elements, the behavioural science around what happens next is going to be very interesting to see being rolled out. Luke, I want to come back to you for a moment because, and again, you used that word transparency, and I think that there's, and again, Nuala spoke to it as well, and the transparency around the development of these vaccines has been key. There's also the future need for transparency, and you alluded to earlier on that there are still, there are questions that remain unanswered. So can you speak a little bit more about that, and perhaps your thoughts about how that will tie in with the behavioural elements of the success of the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating time we're in now, let's face it. And we need these vaccines to get us out of this mess. Everybody would agree with that statement, I hope. Now, some might disagree with it, but that's the majority view. We must have widespread vaccination. Now, the kind of things that we hear a lot is the speed, as Nuala had mentioned as well. And we got reassurances there. People should not be worried about how quick these have been developed. That's the consensus view. So in other words, there is, I mean, the regulatory aspects to this are massive. I mean, the pharma sector is the most regulated sector, and all sort of precautions and very great caution was used there. So that's the first thing to say. So that's one concern that we might assuage. But then the unknowns that we have now are, the big one at the moment is, will these vaccines prevent transmission? Now, what that means is, it sounds a bit strange and people are often confused by this. It's a strange thing to say that the vaccine might stop you getting sick from the virus, but you still might be spreading it. Now, how can that be? That can happen because the vaccine is given into your muscle, you get a big immune response, and it stops you getting infected in your lungs effectively. You get a big sort of, your body is now churning antibodies and your lungs don't get infected. But some of the virus might still get into your nose at a low level because the immunity up here isn't as good, say, right? And that means you might have less virus. It hasn't got a foothold in your body, but still it's in your nose. And therefore you might infect someone else. Now, we still don't know the answer to that is still unknown. Now, the signs are good, I have to say. And in fact, just this morning, the Israelis released more data to suggest that maybe the Pfizer vaccine does stop transmission, which would be great. They got a 33% decrease potentially in transmission if you're vaccinated. That's a good sign. What that means is the R number drops because there's less spread. The R number is all about how much it spreads. So there's more optimism around that, but still an unknown. And then what that means is, even though you've been vaccinated, do not assume that you're bulletproof. You still might get infected and you still might spread it. And then you might not get sick yourself, which is great. That's the positive side. But you may infect someone who's vulnerable, and you don't want to do that. So we're looking at a phase now of the next 6 months at a minimum where we keep up with the masks and the hand washing and the distancing. One reason being you still might be transmitting it. But secondly, we need to get to 80% of the community to really put this virus, on the run, as it were, So that's a big question that we all have to keep in mind, and a kind of a guideline that we have. And then the second unknown that we have is, will we need booster shots every winter or not? Now, again, the immunologists are digging into this in great detail. There was a great paper last week, actually, from California, where they're detecting T cells and B cells 8 months after vaccination. Now, these two cell types are critical. The B cells make the antibodies, which bung up the virus. That's the big job of antibodies. The T cells are really required to control everything and keep the whole thing going. So both of those are persisting now for 8 months. That's a really good sign. They might persist for years after the vaccination. And in fact, the SARS vaccine, they were detecting T cells 17 years afterwards. That was the infection actually was given that, to correct myself. But still, there was a persistent immune response against SARS. that lasted for years. And then another big study last week in Oxford, that's a really good one. They looked at healthcare workers in Oxford, and they followed 233 of them who had been infected. And guess what? Only 2 became reinfected after 6 months. Isn't that tremendous? So that really tells us in that group anyway, that infection will protect against reinfection. That's a really good sign, because that means if you've had it, there's a good chance you won't get it again. And then secondly, the vaccine should be even better, by the way. Vaccines are usually much better than the natural infection that causes protection, because the live virus is trying to manipulate your immune system in various ways. A vaccine doesn't do that because it's a piece of the virus. So again, that gives us grounds for optimism that we will see persistent protection over time. But remember, it's very much a work in progress. It's still new, incredibly, and the scientists and the clinical trial people and, post-approval people, they're all watching this every single day to keep an eye on these things. So those are the kind of questions that people have in their minds. The one that we don't worry about, or at least that's probably overstating it, the thing that we're less concerned about is untoward effects from the vaccines, that the safety profile is holding up. And Israel is like the canary in the coal mine in a way for this. They've now given the vaccine to 2 million people. And the safety data we had from the Pfizer trial is holding up with the actual real life use of the vaccine. So that's great, because that means there was always a risk that 40,000 people it's safe in, go to 2 million, you might see some problems, but that's not the case. So that's a good one. But again, it's a work in progress that we're monitoring very closely.
And it's incredibly exciting, and I suppose it's a live experiment, in a global live experiment where the data is ongoing, and we really are part of, without wishing to sound trite, we are part of probably the world's biggest experiments. Yeah, and it's phenomenal. I want Karina and Molly, I'd like to have a chat to you both really for a moment. And Karina, you were part of the Imperial Trial, and coming into it, and you're a professor of English, and related to that. And Molly, I'm really interested to know about, and for both of you, Karina, what was your, as somebody without a science background, what was your sense of the way the science was being communicated? And then leading on from that, Molly, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the role of that science is currently playing and the way that it's being disseminated, and how we can do better, or is there a need to do better, or how is it being heard by the general public? So Karina, I'll come to you first. What was your sense of the science, when you were involved in the trial?
My awareness of, well, it's difficult to know what I was aware of, because it's hard to know what you're not aware of. It's sort of an impossibility. But what I got the sense of was certainly a certain type of person was willing to do the trial, and they were, I wouldn't say it's a personality thing, but more a question of their background. Lots of students, lots of young people in their 20s who were very, very keen and interested. And I think for them, not only did the cause resonate, but the science resonated. It made sense to them. They were happy with what they read or what they were told. And then there are other people who were obviously not at the trial and who I wouldn't meet there, who had serious reservations, and they may have just as good a grasp on the medical details, but for other reasons they might be concerned. And it struck me that what put us at ease as participants was really being talked to, and having our concerns listened to, and having things explained to us in a way that was patient and non-judgmental. And I think the same needs to be applied to the other group, for them to have their concerns listened to and not dismissed. I appreciate that can be time consuming, and I'm not really sure how that would be scaled up. But there is a sense that there is a large community out there who do have quite specific concerns that could perhaps be addressed in a similar way, through detailed conversation or through detailed information that's targeted in that fashion.
Thank you so much, Karina. Molly, could I ask you to come in on that and speak a little bit further?
Yeah, Gillian, I suppose it reminds me of something that I have been thinking a lot about, in terms of how the last year has been such a fantastic year actually for science communication. So, I've spent 20 years trying to get people to listen to what I do in my research, and mostly people don't give a damn. You know, but all of a sudden people are actually interested. And I think that, you know, I would give huge credit to organizations such as RTE, outlets such as the Irish Times, which are, you know, very highly consumed in Ireland. I mean, 80% of the general public rely on RTE as their highest source of information. So I think we're in a very fortunate position in Ireland that we have that type of a relatively well-educated population. I think people's interest, I mean, it waxes and wanes. I know there's elements of people, you know, I think particularly at this difficult juncture that we're at, there's an element of people not wanting to know to some degree, because I think that can be a coping strategy as well. But I think generally since the outset of the pandemic, the public has been extremely interested in science. And I think that certainly in Ireland, I think we have done a really good job of communicating science. I think Luke is a really shining example actually of somebody who has really engaged with the media in a way that's very accessible. And I suppose one of the things I've always appreciated about his input is that it's extremely upbeat. I think what we really need to resist at this time is hopelessness. You know, we're all putting up with a lot of shit. You know, it's hard, it's tough, we're homeschooling, we're restricted, we can't do anything, there's no plans in the diary, it's tough. You know, so the last thing we need actually is constant doom and gloom, and it's our fault and we're to blame and we'll be fined if we go further than the prom or whatever, you know. So I think science communication has been good in Ireland. So thinking specifically around communication around the vaccine, I think we're still at very early stages, and I think we're in a delicate position at the minute, because I think there is a lot of discussion in the media about, oh, Ireland, we're very slow, and oh my God, if we leave this to the HSE, it's going to be a complete disaster. And this morning I had a meeting with HSE colleagues who were talking about, you know, paper databases of, you know, people to get the vaccine. And, you know, we don't have a great track record of data or these kinds of data-driven processes. This is not Ireland's forte by any means. I mean, I think we have seen Ireland's forte since the start of the pandemic, which is huge levels of solidarity, trust, really brilliant sense of community. So that kind of aspect of our society has carried us through brilliantly. I think for communication now around the vaccine, it's going to be very, very important that we do it properly. We need to invest all our energies now in this area and doing it properly and getting it really up and running well, because I do think it is a time that there is a risk of slipping into, oh, we're rubbish at this. And, you know, I think once you enter into that territory, you're going to lose that 17, 18% who think, well, you know, obviously it's a shambles, you know, and we cannot afford to lose anyone in the campaign. So I think around communication, it's about clear, consistent communication. I think we need to be very upfront around, you know, Nuala is talking there about evolving adaptive trials, evolving science. Things are going to change. It's not just we have all the definitive truth now and we can disseminate it. I think it is really important that scientists remain open about these changes, because I think once you start trying to cover stuff up, you're going down, you know, dangerous territory with that. So I think clear, consistent communication from trusted sources. One of the things that the Department of Health data, so this is the Amara Research Tracker Survey that they conduct on a weekly basis, and this survey has focused on people's attitudes to the vaccination since around the middle of November. So we have really strong data, I suppose, in terms of the Irish population's beliefs around vaccinations. And one thing that consistently comes through is the huge levels of trust that the Irish population have in healthcare professionals, and in particular GPs. So I think what that means for the communication strategy is healthcare professionals and GPs need to be supported to the maximum to have the information to hand. So they can be really, really valuable ambassadors for the vaccination program. But, you know, they're operating potentially in vacuums as well. So I think that ensuring that that channel of that channel of communication to healthcare professionals, and particularly those working in primary care, is really important, because they are the people who are most respected by the general population.
Thank you so much for that, Molly. There's some really lovely things to consider about that. And you're right, the roles that the GPs will play. And I think especially now as we know with the Pfizer and Moderna and the need for the vaccine being treated in a particular way, I think, am I right in saying that it'll really be the Oxford vaccine, when that starts getting rolled out, that GPs will begin to play a key role? Nuala, can I come back to you for a moment, because Molly was suggesting there, there has been challenges, in multiple ways, and Luke said this as well. I imagine that the development of the COVID-19 vaccines I'd be right in saying that it's really changed the landscape in multiple ways of vaccine development. It certainly nuanced it. Can you tell us a bit about, we've heard challenges around the emergence of the mutations or the different strains of the virus, and I think that one of the things that was pointed out in various times was lack of inclusion of pregnant women in trials. Can you tell us a bit about what were some of the challenges being faced during the vaccine development, and how do pharmaceutical companies respond to those?
Sure. And I may just start with one comment stemming from what Luke was referring to earlier around speed and maybe concerns around speed. The speed of development was driven by a couple of key factors in my mind, which is important in answering your questions. First of all, the role of the regulators. Typically in the US, it would take 6 weeks to have a trial approved. We saw a period of 8 days. Typically in Latin America, it can take 6 months onwards. We saw approvals in 3 weeks. So what actually occurred was that there was just extreme regulatory focus on actually ensuring the approvals went through fast. The principal investigators were focused on ensuring the clinics were up and running. We had situations where a submission went in on a Saturday, engagement of subjects and people wanting to be in the trial. And, it was just phenomenal to see how everyone brought it together. Phenomenal to see then how the data monitoring boards were working, how the data was being supplied really in a 24/7 basis to really ensure that no corners were cut. The quality of the data, the safety of the patients was the ultimate aim to make sure that we were following people. And it's fair to say that we're still following people. The regulators expect long-term safety data. So whilst we commenced in June of last year, we're working through the data. And as you work through the data, you make more decisions. As you work through the data, you broaden your patient population. So whilst at the outset, there was probably more of a focus on an elderly population, as trials progress, there's more of a focus on a more junior population. So we're focusing on adolescents, we're focusing on pediatrics. Maternal trials were not the preliminary focus, albeit I am aware that there's one trial that does include pregnant women, albeit it's not the targeted objective of the trial. And now there's one other trial that is specifically targeting maternal subjects. So the intent is to get a totally representative or total representation of the population as we see it today, whether it's from a gender perspective, obviously mothers, age, and ethnic origins as well. So all of these considerations are really important in A, designing the trial, and B, conducting the trial, and C, ensuring that when the vaccine is in the population, that everyone is really represented.
Thank you for that, Nuala. In terms of long-term COVID vaccine, I mean, what can we expect next? What's likely to be coming down the pipeline in terms of news around the vaccines?
Today, in the public domain, there's over 100 trials that are ongoing. I think Luke referenced the trials that are really ahead, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, AstraZeneca. So, what's important is, I mentioned that these trials are, it's about rolling submissions. It's about monitoring the data on an ongoing basis. So that is going to continue. Typically, the expectation would be to follow people for 2 years. So, what we need to continue to focus on is the data as it's coming through and how that may influence future decisions. I think Luke was also referencing, around, how protected are you and in what time frame. So those are the questions we're still trying to answer as we continue to follow subjects over time. There are new trials coming out. There's still a continued focus on the industry on finding broader solutions. So I think we can expect more data. We'll continue on the route of transparency and ensure that we're really focusing on representing the population today.
Building on from that, I'm going to take us, Luke, can I come back to you for a moment? The COVID vaccine, can we contextualize it in the world of vaccines? How has the last year, what impact is the last year going to have on the future of vaccines?
Yeah, that's an exciting thing to think about, Gillian, to be honest, because this RNA approach, now we know that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are these RNA vaccines. I think as Karina might have said, that they were never approved in humans before. And now it works and it seems to be safe. Now, what that means is that technology could be used against other diseases. So in other words, you may well see vaccines emerging for the common cold of all things, because it's in the same family. And they've been trying to get a vaccine for the cold for decades. Now, the trouble is there's many different viruses there. But still there's talk of that. There's also talk of malaria even. HIV, they're now on the table. Now, they're slightly different diseases, so it's not exactly comparable, but I think we will see more vaccines coming down. The effort towards vaccines will be ramped up in the industry without doubt. I saw a big analysis yesterday, a biotech analyst, and vaccines is the number one thing now in the biotech industry's mind, because this has been proven to work. It could work in other diseases. Now, and then you move into cancer, by the way, because the RNA technology was initially developed by BioNTech for anti-tumor vaccines, you see, not necessarily infectious diseases. So you can imagine now we're going to get what I call tumor antigens. These are proteins that are different in a tumor. You could now get an immune response to that tumor through this RNA technology. So what we're seeing now is a lot of excitement because of this RNA approach working. The other thing I would say is, remember, and Nuala kind of said this as well, there's many more vaccines coming down the track. And the ones that are coming next are using more traditional technologies. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is using what's called an adenoviral vector. That's been used in other vaccines before, and they've popped in a piece of the COVID-19 virus into that format. That will be a one-shot vaccine, is one prediction there, not a two-shot. Now, if that gets launched, that could begin to dominate because the one shot's more convenient. Now, we'll get data on the Johnson & Johnson trials will start to come out probably towards the end of the month. The initial trial data looks like we've heard will begin to be published, and we'll see how efficacious it is. There are rumors of high efficacy with that vaccine. And then we go beyond that into other vaccines that are again using the whole attenuated virus, because the other more traditional way to make a vaccine is to take the germ, inactivate it, and use that as a vaccine. And there's several in development using that approach. Now the big question becomes, I've got sympathy for the pharmaceutical sector, because there's going to be maybe 30 vaccines available eventually, Now, how do you get into the marketplace? Now, maybe some will work better in some populations. Some are going to be cheaper for sure. The AstraZeneca vaccine is an eighth the price of the Pfizer one. That could be a factor, convenience. Now, we're all experts on ultra cold now, aren't we, with the Pfizer one, you see? So we're going to see much more. I mean, and the Johnson & Johnson will be keep in the fridge. You don't need a -70 freezer. So in other words, what you're going to see now is, a huge embarrassment of riches in terms of vaccination. And then we're going to see vaccination campaigns against other pathogens emerging. This will take 2, 3, 4 years now. It won't be in the immediate term, And then the last thing I'd say, Gillian, is this virus will become endemic. Now, what that means is it's never going to go away. It'll become another virus that will give you symptoms of a disease. And most of us will catch it, or let's put it this way, it'll be a childhood thing. So in other words, once you've vaccinated everybody, if you like, the children begin getting a vaccine in childhood, and that will now begin to protect them. And then the virus becomes endemic in the population. So that's the kind of future that we're looking at now. Now, again, to be fully transparent, things can go wrong. We don't know. It's new, But remember, we're on top of that. I mean, all the immunologists and the industry people are watching this so closely. So we're just there's an element of keeping your fingers crossed, because, I mean, one of the negatives is if a new variant did emerge, there's still a risk of that. It's unlikely. We think this virus does not mutate that quickly. There's optimism. We saw actually last week, there's good reason to believe the Pfizer vaccine will work against multiple variants, But that's one thing to watch, that it may mutate into a different form. But again, that's being kept, we're keeping a very close eye on that kind of question.
It certainly does. I mean, there's clear optimism coming from all camps, really. And I think, Molly, you spoke to that, being mindful of how we're having these discussions, around the future. I'm going to just come back to you for a second, Karina, just on that note. If you were to, as arguably one of the very first recipients of a vaccine in the world, just in case there are people, and I suppose speaking to that cohort that Molly was talking about earlier on, maybe the people who are a little bit, we talk about that vaccine hesitancy. What would you say to people who are maybe have one foot in that camp?
I would say we live right now in a world of so many unknowns, right? You can get on a bus, touch something, kiss someone, or breathe near a lamppost and get sick. And you can get sick with a virus that we don't fully understand yet in terms of its long-term effects on people. In terms of brain damage, in terms of long-term exhaustion. People are talking about long COVID at the moment and not really fully understanding what that is. The great thing about a vaccine is you can understand it. It's developed to be understood. It's developed in this context whereby you absolutely intimately know everything about this substance. So I would say go for the known option. I appreciate there is some hesitancy and a fear that it may be unknown, but from my perspective, I maintain it's not as unknown and not as dangerous as potentially getting the virus.
What a wonderful way to put it. Go for the known. Absolutely fantastic. Folks, I think we might have to wrap up. I think we could all spend a long time speaking about this topic. It's just fascinating. And as we've all said, it's still an emerging situation. But I want to say a massive thank you to all of the panelists for all of their insight today. It's been really, really wonderful speaking to you. And a huge thank you to ICON for hosting the Living With series. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and come and visit Science Gallery soon when it's open. Thank you all so much for being here.